Hi, and welcome to Conservation University. Today we're going to talk about composting. My name is Brenda Sanders, and I'm with the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture in Stillwater. And I'm actually part of the OSU Extension's Think Water group, and we've partnered with the City of Edmond's Water Resources Program, Conservation University, to bring you classes on outdoor water conservation. Just as a little review, we're going to take a look at Edmond's outdoor water use. And water consumption in Edmond during the winter months is about 8 million gallons a day. However, during the summer months, it over triples to up to 26 million gallons a day. And that's a lot of water during the summer, which indicates that it's mostly outdoor water use. Also, the population of Edmond has increased in the past 20 years about 35%, from 68,000 to over 92,000. And I'm guessing when we get the results from this latest census, it's going to be even more than that. As a result, the city of Edmond is currently investing over $400 million to upgrade and expand its water and wastewater infrastructure. And that's why they decided to do some education on water conservation, ways that you can save water that can help lower your bill and make more water available for use where it's needed. And you might say, well, what's composting got to do with water conservation? And you might be surprised, it actually has quite a bit to do with it. So we're going to start out today with a definition of just what composting is. And actually, compost just happens. It's a process in nature. It's the biological reduction of organic waste to humus. And organic waste is basically anything that has been alive, leaves, grass clippings, anything like that. And it just happens all on its own. However, it's not really on its own. There are a whole host of critters known as the decomposers, and they're basically in two groups. The first group are the chemical decomposers, and these are things like roundworms, protozoa, bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes. You can't see these with the naked eye. Most of these you have to have a microscope. And they break down organic debris through chemical methods. Then we have a whole other large group of physical decomposers. And these are generally the ones that you can see crawling around in your compost pile, things like centipedes, millipedes, sow bugs, slugs, and snails. The interesting thing about this is a lot of those creatures that I named, they're not something you really want to see on your garden plants. You don't want slugs and snails. They eat your hostas. A lot of these sow bugs will eat the roots of plants. Well, that's the point. In the compost pile, they're doing what they actually should be doing. And so in the compost pile, they're the good guys. They're an indicator that things are working like they should be. And so you want to have them go to work for you. And basically, when you compost, you're creating an environment that is conducive to all of these getting their job done. And so you're creating a place that they want to live, basically. And you might say, well, if compost just happens anyway, why in the world would you bother to actually compost, have a compost pile and tend it and things like that? Well, here's the reason. A lot of our yard trash, organic waste, leaves, things like that, they don't end up landing where we want them to. You know, in the forest floor, it's no big deal when leaves cover the forest floor and then they break down. However, if they cover our fescue lawn, and this time of year in the fall, it's very important to keep the leaves off the fescue so that they get all that sunlight, because this is when fescue grows. All the cool season lawn grasses grow right now, when it's cool outside and we probably get a little bit more rain than we do in the summer. It's important to keep the leaves off. Same thing with grass clippings. If you don't have a mulching mower, you don't want to leave all those grass clippings right on top, because again, they're covering up the grass. And then you also have plant prunings. You might have garden trash after the season's over, all that stuff. It usually ends up in bags and piled at the curb to go off into the landfill. And what we want to do when we compost is to keep all of that material in our system that's going on in our landscape. And so basically, when we compost, it's the process by which we transform organic waste into a soil building substance. And essentially, what we're doing is we're controlling where it happens. And also, as you'll find out today, we can kind of control the rate that it happens. We can help it and provide it with the environment it needs to happen quicker. So basically, we're giving all of those critters that I showed you that do the composting, we're giving them everything they need to be able to do their job at maximum capacity. And so that's basically what composting is. Now, there are several benefits to actually composting and then to our final product. And one of the big advantages, the organic matter that we get from composting, it increases soil organic matter content, and that's very important to plant health. If we can have a higher percentage of organic matter in our soil, it helps make nutrients available to plants. It also helps the soil structure so that plant roots can grow deeper and have more contact with both nutrients and with water, and that's important. The organic matter also feeds and supports living things in the soil, and of course the one that we're probably most familiar with are earthworms. And most of us know if we have earthworms in our soil, it's going to be good for all the plants. They basically help to turn that soil from just dirt into a beautiful crumbly structure that's beneficial for all plants. The other thing that composting does is it recycles yard waste. So it, again, keeps that waste in our yard in a useful fashion instead of having it hauled off. And finally, and here's where it's really tied to water conservation, organic matter actually improves drainage and water holding capacity in soil. And it does this in both clay soils and sandy soils. Clay soils, which you all probably have a lot around Edmond, are like brick a lot of the time. They're hard and plant roots can't get down through that when they're dry. And so what organic matter does is it helps kind of aerate that soil and make it where the plant roots can get down in there, the water can drain down through there, and it also helps clay soils not have a hard crust on the top that water droplets hit and then run off and go down the street instead of soaking down in. So it basically, all of that process, we say it helps the clay soils drain better, and it also helps sandy soils hold water better. You know, sandy soil is like a sieve. It basically, the water hits it, it drains down through it, and it drains out of the root zone, and the roots can't get it. The clay soil or the sandy soils dry very quickly. And so what organic matter does is it acts like a sponge in there to hold the water and hold it up in the root zone. It also helps hold nutrients up there. And then plants can get to that water and access it. So it's very important for organic matter can really help the drought tolerance of the plants that are grown in soil that has organic matter in it. Now, there are several types of composting, and we're going to actually talk about 3 of those types today. Cold composting is pretty much just toss it in a pile and let compost happen. You don't really do a whole lot to it. It's just a matter of piling it up. Vermicomposting, on the other hand, is using earthworms to create compost, and a lot of people enjoy that, and it's actually a fun project to do with kids because kids like to see the earthworms and feed them, and also it can be made in a smaller container. Vermicomposting can be carried out in a contained system that you can actually do indoors, whereas other types of composting really don't lend themselves to practicing indoors. And finally, hot composting, which is what we're going to expand on today, is another method of composting that kind of speeds up the whole process. Now, if you're interested in cold composting or just more of the basics, take a look at one of our previously recorded classes that's on the website, the composting class here. If you want just some more basic information about composting, I would suggest watching this video. If you're interested in learning more about vermicomposting, the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service has 2 great fact sheets, and you could go down to your county office and get these. You can also find them online at the OSU Extension website, and just search up here in the search bar. You could just type in vermicomposting, and those 2 fact sheets will come up, and then you can read those online, or you can click on a PDF file and download it and print it out if you need a paper copy. So now let's talk more about hot composting and just how do we do that. And one of the easiest ways to really understand the process is to compare cold composting versus hot composting. Now, remember I said in the cold composting system, you basically just pile everything and let compost happen. And so that's basically what we do. Now, in hot composting, what you do is you actually build your entire compost pile at one time. And then you allow all those microorganisms and other bugs and slugs and things like that to go to work. So with cold composting, you can just add things to the pile, and hot composting, you make your entire pile at once and then let it compost. Now, there are pros and cons to both of these. With cold composting, let's see if I can get my pointer here. Here we go. It needs little maintenance. That's one of the great pros of it. You really don't have to do a whole lot once you've either built some kind of a bin or just figured out where you're going to pile everything. So it doesn't need much maintenance, and again, it allows for materials to be added a little at a time. Kitchen scraps, you can just take them out as you get them. Some of the cons of cold composting are that nutrients can leach out of the pile because it sits there for a long time, and as it rains and water maybe your irrigation hits the pile or something like that, the nutrients can leach out. Also, the compost has more undecomposed bits because they're different sizes. And so very large pieces, say you have some watermelon rinds or something like that in there, they're not going to break down as quickly as smaller pieces will. So you'll have some pieces that aren't decomposed. It also fails to kill pathogens or plant diseases or weed seeds. So you don't want to put those in your compost pile. And that's actually important no matter what. Not to put diseased plants in, and also not to put weeds that have seeds in. And finally, it takes a long time for cold composting to happen. It can take 6 months to 2 years to finish and have a finished product. So it takes a while. Now with hot composting, some of the pros are it produces finished compost quickly. It also kills most weed seeds and pathogens. However, we don't recommend that you put diseased plant material or weed seeds in your compost pile, just in case it doesn't get hot enough. And there actually are some plant diseases like tobacco mosaic virus that actually affects tomatoes. And you don't want to put those in there because heat won't kill that virus. So anyway, keep those out of your pile. The finished compost is nice and stable. There aren't big undecomposed bits in it. And then finally, the really great part about hot composting is it can produce finished compost, in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. So that's great if you need compost to get, instead of having to wait 6 months to 2 years, you've got something in 2 to 3 weeks that you can work into your garden. Now, that does not come without a price, because one of the cons of hot composting is it's labor intensive. You have to work for that black gold. You need to control the moisture and also the carbon nitrogen ratio. So you have to watch your pile more closely. And the other thing is it has to be built all at once. So you don't just take kitchen scraps out and toss them in, I'm going to do that 3 times a week. You kind of have to collect them all and then build your pile in layers and then let it compost. So there are pros and cons to both of them. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about just how hot composting or thermophilic composting works. And basically those critters that I was talking about earlier, the chemical decomposers, they're in 2 different groups. There's some that are mesophilic, which is at a lower temperature range from about 40 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we also have the thermophiles, and they operate at higher temperatures, 110 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And what you're doing when you turn your compost pile and other things that you do to it is you're trying to maintain a temperature that's right around 100 to 140 degrees, because these thermophiles work faster at breaking down that organic matter than the mesophiles do. And so as the temperature goes up and down in your compost pile, that kind of speeds up or slows down the decomposition process. And so mesophilic decomposers are going to continue to break down the organic matter, but it's not going to happen as quickly. So just how do you create that environment? Well, there are several variations on this, but we're going to talk about the Berkeley method of hot composting today. And basically, to start with, you need to have a pile that is at least 3 foot by 3 foot, basically a cubic square of plant material. And the easiest way to do that is to build a bin, 3 to 4 foot high, wide, and deep is good. You don't want to get much over that. You know, over 5 foot is probably getting too big, but that anywhere from 3 to 5 feet is good. And you don't actually have to have a bin, but it helps a lot. Because if you just pile it on the ground, if you just pile all that material on the ground, what happens is it tends to kind of just widen and spread out, and then you lose your critical mass of that cubic yard, and you won't get the high temperatures. So if you have some type of bin, it can help with that process. The other thing that you want to be sure to do is to chop or shred all of your coarse materials. The optimum size is anywhere from 1/2 inch diameter to about 1.5 inches diameter. So that's the optimum size for the materials that go in there. Anything bigger than that, you're going to want to chop it up. And things that are smaller than that will work, but you don't want everything to be really small. And just as an example, you know how grass clippings tend to mat together and then they really start to smell bad? That will happen in your compost pile if you have all really small pieces. It mats together. There's not good air circulation in there. And so you tend to have it starts slowing down the decomposition process. Now, you can use some bulky material that you put in the bottom of the bin, either branches or twigs, or you can even use like a pallet. And this isn't really part of the compost. It's basically the floor of the compost bin that allows for some air circulation to go in to the pile. And that's just very helpful. And so when you turn your pile, you're not going to incorporate any of this into the pile. It's really not part of the compost. It's the floor of the compost. And the other thing that you want to do is you want to layer the material in here. You want to layer about 2 parts of brown material to 1 part green material. And you just basically make that all at once. And then you want to add water. And you want to have about 50% saturation of water in there. Then you want to turn the pile on a regular basis, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But before we get to that, I want to talk about that 2 parts to 1 part. What you're controlling there is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And our optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio is 30 to 1. And generally speaking, let's take grass clippings, they're green. Your green items, your lush green, full of water items are going to have a higher nitrogen content than your dry brown items. And grass clippings have a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 19 to 1. And basically, if this first number is anywhere below 25, then that means it's getting high in nitrogen. It's got a lot of nitrogen in it. Now, moving over to this side, look, we've got a number of 40 for these leaves, 40 to 1. That's high in carbon. And so you want to have that ratio be 30-1. And you might go, well, how am I going to know what the ratio is of the stuff I'm putting in? And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But I wanted to show you, like, if I were putting equal parts of grass clippings to leaves in my pile, say I were filling a 5-gallon bucket and then putting it in, I'd have 1 bucket of grass clippings and 1 bucket of leaves. Add those together, divide by 2, we get 30-1. If I had 3 things in here, I'd add all 3 of them up and divide by 3, and that's how I get my carbon to nitrogen ratio. So how do I find out what that ratio is for everything? Well, you can look it up, you can Google it, and they'll tell you. And also there are several books that have the carbon to nitrogen ratio of different types of organic debris, shredded cardboard. And remember, organic means anything that was once living. And remember that cardboard and paper were once living. They were once plant material. So they count. You can put those in your compost pile. But shredded cardboard has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 350-1. It's very high in carbon. Corn stalks, 75-1. Leaves are 60-1. Leaves kind of vary. And you can actually see this out in nature. If you have oak leaves and then you have maple leaves, the oak leaves are going to break down much slower than the maple leaves are because they've got a higher ratio. Oak leaves tend to be about 60-65-1, whereas maple leaves tend to be 30-35-1. So that's why they're breaking down more quickly. Also, pine needles takes them a long time to break down, 80-1. Straw, again, it's high in carbon, 75-1. Then we get down here to clover, and you see how this number here has dropped down. We've dropped down into the higher nitrogen levels. Clover's 23-1, coffee grounds 20-1, garden waste 30-1, and manures. Manures are very high in nitrogen, 15-1 is our ratio there. And so they make a great addition to your compost pile. Now you might think that's a lot of information to keep track of, and I don't think I really want to mess with all that. Well, guess what? There is an easier way. You can basically ballpark it in that 2 to 3 browns to 1 green should keep you in that good carbon to nitrogen ratio. And when we talk about browns, of course, they're basically things that are brown or tan and dry. And leaves, dry grass clippings go into this category. Shredded cardboard, paper products, sawdust, hay. There are all sorts of things that are in this brown category. So you want to put, if you're putting, again, we'll think about putting in 5-gallon buckets worth, you'd put 2 to 3 of these in to 1 bucket of, say, fruit and vegetable scraps, which are in our green category. Green grass clippings are high in nitrogen. The thing with grass clippings, be sure not to put grass clippings that have been treated with herbicides into your compost pile, because you don't know, there are some of those that might persist, and you don't want to be putting those on your landscape plants or your vegetable garden. Coffee grounds are high in nitrogen, and also weeds with no seeds, hair, both pet hair and human hair, and also manures. Now, my asterisk here is to remind me to say the manure that you can put into your compost pile needs to be from herbivores. It needs to be from animals that eat only plants. So think cows and chickens and horses. You don't want to put dog or cat manure in, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. Things like eggshells also are high in nitrogen. Eggshells are good to add too because they're also high in calcium. So these are all the quote-unquote green things. Now, coffee grounds and eggshells don't tend to be green per se, but when we say green, hair either, I guess, unless you've colored it, but when we say green, we're kind of talking about most of these are green in color, but they also just are things that are high in nitrogen. So those are things that are in the quote-unquote green group. Now, things that you don't want to add to your compost pile are diseased plants. We talked about that earlier. Also, weeds with seeds. Now, you can put weeds in if they don't have seed heads. Now, the exception to that is you don't want to put plants that spread by roots and runners. And the classic example of this is you can put Bermuda grass clippings in, what you would mow off the top, the leaf, but you cannot put Bermuda grass sprigs, the runners and the stolons and the roots. You don't want to put those in your compost pile because if you do that, you end up with this beautiful mound of Bermuda grass. So don't make the mistake of putting those in, but you can put the clippings off the top in to the pile. You also don't want to put plastic or petroleum products into the pile. It needs to be organic and not synthetic. You don't want to put meat, bones, grease, and oils in. Even though those may be organic, you don't want to put those in because those will attract larger critters to your compost pile that want to find those meat scraps and bones and things like that. So you don't want to put those in. That's the same reason you don't want to put dairy products in. And you also don't want to put cooked foods that would have sauces or butter. All of these things attract undesirable animals to your compost pile. So don't put those in. And finally, you don't want to put pet manure in, like dogs and cats. Anything that is a carnivore, like dogs, cats, and humans, you don't want to put the manure from them into your compost pile because that can spread disease. And we don't want to put something that might be spreading disease into our landscape or into our vegetable garden or anything like that. So while herbivore manure is great, carnivore manure, keep it out of the pile. Now, one of the important things to hot composting is turning the pile. After we've built the entire pile, we have it all in there, but we actually don't want to turn it for the first 4 days. We want to let it basically start, quote unquote, cooking. You want the internal temperature of that pile to get up into that 140 degrees Fahrenheit range before you turn it. So it's going to take it a while to get going. But after the first 4 days, you actually want to turn the pile every other day. Here's where the labor intensity comes in. And when you turn the pile, you want to take everything that's on the outside and then you want to put it on the inside of the other pile. And then you take the inside and put it on the outside. And this basically keeps it all mixed up. Now, this brings up a point that if you're going to do hot composting, it's actually easier if you have at least 2 bins because you want one to have the actual cooking compost in it, and then you have the other one to turn it into, because remember I said you're doing this like every other day. you need to have a place to put it to turn it into. So that's important. And the thing about turning the pile, what you're doing is you're keeping the temperature from getting too high, where it gets up above 160, that 160 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit phase. We actually don't want our pile to be up there, because when that happens, it starts to kill some of the beneficial organisms in there, the bacteria. And then what happens is it kills them off, and then our pile quits composting. It basically completely stops composting. So you want to turn this pile to keep that temperature basically at a constant rate. So there are a few tools that are very helpful to tending a compost pile. And one of the very helpful tools is a garden fork. Now, a shovel's good when you go to spread the compost out, but when you're actually working with the organic material before it's composted, you know, those can be some twiggy or chunky, and a shovel's not going to go down in that pile. A garden fork is very handy to be able to turn the compost. The other thing that we've talked about is you want to have bins, and it's nice to have at least two. A lot of times you'll see them set up in sets of 3, and that's basically to have 2 bins to actually do the composting process, and then you have a third bin to store your finished product in, and then you can just store it there and use it as you need it. The other thing about bins is that it's good if you can take the front off of them, or at least the top half of it, so that you can get in there and turn the compost easily, as opposed to having to stand on a stool or something and reach over the top to get down in here to get to it. So if you can take the front off, that helps a lot. Another tool that is convenient to have, but you don't have to have it, is a compost thermometer. Remember, I talked about how you're wanting to monitor that temperature. Well, if you have a compost thermometer, which is basically a thermometer that has a long probe on it, this is about a 1.5 feet long, so that you can stick it down into this and measure the temperature in the center of the pile. The temperatures around the edges are going to be a lot cooler. It's that temperature in the middle that you really want to keep track of. So that's where a thermometer can come in handy. And then another fun tool, and handy too, is a moisture meter. And again, you don't have to have this, but it is nice because you can just stick it, again, it's on a probe. You stick it down in there and you can see, I've got 50% moisture, I'm doing good, or it's running a little dry, I need to add some water. A moisture meter is nice. Now, you can actually just use your hand and figure out if your compost pile is too wet or dry. If you take a handful of it and you squeeze it, and water comes gushing out, your pile is too wet. Also, if you take a handful and you squeeze it and it just is very dry and there's no water coming out, then your compost is too dry. If you squeeze it and it kind of stays a little stuck together, and maybe 1 or 2 drops of water comes out of it, that is the perfect moisture level. So again, basically composting is pretty, you don't need a lot of tools, but the ones that I've mentioned are very helpful and also kind of fun. Now, your compost pile is going to tell you when it has problems. If it's dry and it's like the temperature is not going up, the temperature's staying low, my pile is not working, it means you have insufficient water. You need to add water to the pile. If you have an ammonia smell, that means you've got too much green in there, you've got too much nitrogen. And so you'll want to add some carbon. This is the one exception where you can actually add to the hot compost. If it's starting to smell like ammonia, you need to get some more carbon in there. And so add sawdust or hay, something that's high in carbon, and then you want to turn the pile. Also, if your pile starts smelling like rotting garbage, it's probably too wet. You need to, again, get a little bit drier material in there. And also, if it's raining a lot, you can cover the top, make a little roof or cover it with black plastic and keep it from getting rained on, and that will help where you've got more control over the amount of moisture that's going into your pile. And that's pretty much it. It's really one of those things that sounds very complicated, but then if you have all of your materials together and start working with it, and you know why things are happening with your compost pile, it's pretty easy to kind of get a rhythm going and get it dialed in. Now, back when I was talking about turning your compost pile, that and how that regulates how fast it happens. Now, you can decide, I want compost quickly, so I'm going to turn the pile. I'm going to turn it every other day. That'll get you in that 2 to 3 week range, depending on the outdoor temperature too. Now, if it's during the winter, it's not going to happen that fast because it's not going to be able to heat up quite as much. But if you don't want to turn it that often, you can still get by turning it every third day, or maybe once a week. What that does is it's just going to slow the process down so that instead of 2 to 3 weeks, it might be 2 to 3 months before you get finished compost. So anyway, you can basically decide just how much, how soon do I need that black gold to put on my vegetable bed, and then you can go from there. Now, there are several resources if you want to know more about composting or anything else that has to do with your landscape. You can go to the OSU Extension website and search for topics, plant-related topics. You can search all sorts of things that you might need to know about. You can also from there, you can look for water conservation in the Think Water website, and we have more tips on how to conserve water in your landscape. And you can also go to your county cooperative extension office. And we say cooperative extension unless you've used them before. You may not know what that means. And basically, that's an extension of the University of Oklahoma State University out to the communities, large and small, statewide. And educators and specialists, they develop science-based educational programs to help Oklahomans solve local issues, concerns, promote leadership, and manage resources wisely. And that's where water conservation comes into play. We're learning how to manage our water resource in a wise way. If you need help and you want to go by your Oklahoma County Extension office, it's actually located at 2500 Northeast 63rd Street in Oklahoma City, and you can give them a call. And actually right now I would recommend giving them a call because they may not be open to the public at the same hours that they would have been last year this time. So you can give them a call. And also I would recommend that if you are interested in plants, they have a new demonstration garden there that has QR codes on the plant labels. So even if no one's around, you can find out more about the plants that you're seeing in that garden. So that's kind of a neat thing. And thanks for joining us today. And finally, if you could help us out and take our survey, you can do that by scanning this QR code. It will take you to the survey. It'll probably take you 4 or 5 minutes to fill out. That really helps us. It helps us serve you better if we know if what we're telling you is information that you need, or if you need different information. And again, thanks so much for joining us, and happy composting.